Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Dwayne. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce David Montgomery's presentation in Congress, in Aapresid Congress. Thank you for participating in this conference. Dr. Montgomery's presentation is included in the cycle Soil Symposium Gabriel Guerrero, which will be included in the Aapresid Congress. Siempre Vivo, Siempre Verde, Forever Alive, Forever Green. We will have 3 plenary presentations today, making an emphasis on soil importance and its ecosystemic role. Dr. David Montgomery is a professor of soil and space science in the University of Washington in Seattle, United States of America. He's a member of the quaternary research centers. He became a bachelor, or he has a degree in geological science in the Stanford University in 1974, and he has a PhD of geomorphology in the University of California, Berkeley in 1981. He is author of several books, the Growing Revolution, where he develops the topic that will be presented in this conference. He's a geologist, and he engages strongly in agronomy and biology, bringing these 2 disciplines together. He is an excellent scientific journalist, in which character he has traveled along several continents, interviewing scientists and farmers that practice regenerative or conservation agriculture. In this presentation, you can ask questions in the section that you have at the right of your screen. I'll give the speaker the floor. Thank you very much.
En Argentina, soy David Montgomery. Permiso hablo en inglés por mi español es muy rudimentar. I'm delighted to be able to address you at the Aapresid conference from my office in Seattle. I only wish that I was able to be with you in Argentina. But thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. And I intend to share with you a story that I captured in these 3 books: The Hidden Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization, The Hidden Half of Nature, and Growing a Revolution. These are books that I wrote that are focused on the role of soil in human civilizations and the power of rebuilding soil fertility in terms of the future of humanity going forward. Dirt tells the backstory. It's the story you might expect a geologist to tell about soil, looking back through the history of civilizations and the way that societies degraded their land and how that compromised the interests of their descendants. The Hidden Half of Nature builds off of that history to look at the processes, the new microbial science, the new processes of interactions between bacteria and fungi in the soil and how they support the health of crops and the fertility of the land. And Growing a Revolution takes the lessons from that first book, merges it with the science of the second book to address the question of, could we really restore the health and fertility of the soils in the world's farmland using those methods? So first, let me basically start with a quiz. I'm a professor at the University of Washington, so I get to give quizzes. This quiz is very simple. There's one question and there's one right answer. The question is, which planet would you rather live on? The blue one on the left or the red one on the right? The blue one has water, it has an atmosphere, very convenient for living things, but it also has something we tend to take for granted. It has healthy, fertile soil on the continents that allowed plants that helped plants conquer the continents. And Earth is the only planet that we know of that has soil, the merging of biology and geology, the frontier between the Earth's life-filled exterior and its dead, rocky interior. So hopefully you pick the blue planet. There's always a few people that might be interested in going to Mars, but it's going to be very hard for us to farm on Mars because not only is there no water, no atmosphere, there's no life in the soil. And as we'll see, that's actually a critically important piece of what makes soils fertile. So if we look at the state of Earth's soil today, it's actually in relatively bad shape if you look globally relative to what it was at the dawn of the agricultural era. This is the UN's global map of soil degradation, and what it shows you is sort of a broad brush picture of the state of the world's soils, and it gives the impression that we've degraded a lot of the world's land. By most estimates, we've degraded somewhere between a quarter and a third of the world's potentially arable land already in the agricultural era. But I also want to point out that you can go to any one of the red zones on this map, and you can find areas that are rebuilding healthy, fertile soil in ways that really reverse the impression you would take away from this map. So I like to use this map because it paints soil degradation as a global problem, but I also like to point out that there's exceptions everywhere if we pay attention to them and try and learn the lessons of how we can avoid soil degradation into the future. A couple years back, the UN's State of the Soil Assessment reported that humanity's losing about 0.3% of our collective global food production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil degradation. That's a major problem when you think about the rest of this century, because it means that by the year 2100, we're going to erode off, another basically third of the world's topsoil at a time when the human population is projected to grow by about a third. These trends are in opposition to one another and are troubling. It's my contention that agriculture is going to need to change over the course of this century on a global scale if we are to avoid the obvious problems that could come from playing that scenario out. And it's a story that's been played out in the past in different regions around the world. And that's the story that I tell in the Dirt book. It essentially is a story that looks at the backstory of civilizations and how they eroded their fertility out from under themselves. Soil erosion and soil degradation played a role in the demise of ancient civilizations from Neolithic Europe to classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, Central America, and other societies around the world that I documented and cataloged in the Dirt book. It's a fairly common story in the history of human societies to intensively farm a piece of land, degrade it, and then move on to another piece of land. And what you usually find, though, in environmental history textbooks is the idea that deforestation led to the soil loss that helped undermine ancient societies. What I found in researching dirt was actually that there was a different villain. It wasn't so much the axe as it was the plow that followed that contributed to the soil loss and degradation that undermined ancient civilizations. And so what was it about the plow that has led some people to argue that it was one of the most destructive inventions mankind has yet unleashed on the earth? Well, think about what a plow does. It inverts the soil. It turns the soil over. It makes for very good weed control, but it fundamentally disturbs the land, and it can leave the surface of the earth bare and vulnerable to soil loss and soil erosion, and allow soil erosion to race ahead of soil building. And if you think about soil in the way that we might think about our natural, our own bank accounts, think about it as the savings that a civilization has. Income could be soil building, loss, the analogy would be soil erosion. And we know that if we spend money faster than we make it for long enough, you can run out of money. Civilizations, soil kind of works the same way for them. If you erode soil fast enough for long enough, you can literally run out of it. And this has happened to societies around the world. The first one that I'd like to share with you is from the American Southeast, the Piedmont region of the South. So extending from Virginia up there in the upper right-hand corner down to Alabama in the lower left-hand corner. That gray noodle shows you the amount of historical topsoil erosion across the region. And it's from 4 to more than 10 inches across that region. How big a deal is that? Well, the original settlers, the original European settlers who wrote about describing this region, described about 6 to 12 inches of rich, fertile soil on top of the subsoil. And so, as you can see from this gray noodle, if you could erode off virtually all the topsoil across an area that was one of the bread baskets of the original North American colonies, think what the Greeks and the Romans could have done with an 800-year run at central Italy or at southern Greece. It starts to put into perspective the idea that topsoil loss from agricultural erosion could add up significantly over time. Through the generations and centuries, it could play out to degrade the land to the point where places like Syria and Libya today don't seem like agricultural powerhouses, because they're not anymore, yet we have Roman tax records that document high wheat harvests several thousand years ago. Part of the problem in soil degradation is not just the loss of the soil, but it's also the loss of soil organic matter. This shows you 2 slides from a farm and the neighboring forest in that gray noodle in North Carolina. The khaki stuff here is a soil from a conventional tobacco plantation that's been farmed for about 100 years with intensive tillage, intensive nitrogen fertilization. There's not much life in the soil. The organic matter has been bled off of the soil. But if you go to immediately next door across the fence, dig a hole in the forest that's grown back on a farm that was abandoned 150 years ago, what you see is soil like this. It's rich black earth, well, dark earth. It's not as black as some of the soils that I'll show you in a little bit, but it's much more fertile than the soil that's been farmed for 100 years. The only difference between these soils really is how it's been treated by people for 100 years. It's the same parent material in the same climate, the same place. The difference was the farmer. And I think you could all agree that one of these would be preferable to farm in than the other if you were given a choice. And that example is not atypical. It's fairly common across North America. If you look at the average soil organic matter loss across North American farmlands, we've lost about 50% relative to what our lands started with at the time that the forests and prairies were first converted to farmlands. We've lost half of our soil organic matter in just a couple hundred years of farming. This is something that's not helping us today in terms of farming, and that we have to supplement supporting high yields with high agrochemical inputs, based in part because of the degraded state of much of our farmland. It's not true across the board, but a lot of it is. And it's not just a North American problem. This is a pair of slides from coffee plantations in Central America. The one on the left is actually just outside of coffee plantation in the jungle. So it's kind of like that example from North Carolina, just outside of the jungle on a part that's hasn't been farmed, and coffee's been planted for only about the last 100 years in this valley. Notice the thick, about a 1 foot thick or so, organic matter rich, black colored topsoil. Now look at the slide on the right. That's a soil profile and a road cut from a conventional coffee plantation in the same valley. You'll notice something's missing. The topsoil. It's subsoil right on up to the surface where there's a thin layer of organic matter. It took just 100 years of coffee cultivation in this valley to essentially lose the entire topsoil. Soil loss and erosion is not just an ancient problem. It's not just something that afflicted ancient civilizations. It's something that's very real today. It affects the farmers of North Carolina, the farmers of this part of Costa Rica. And so in researching dirt, I started to ask myself, well, how fast are the world's cropland soils actually eroding? So I did something that has gotten difficult to ask many North American students to do these days, and that is go to the library. I went and I gathered all the papers that I could find, some 1,400 academic studies that had examined rates of soil loss off of tilled agricultural fields around the world, and I came up with a global average for topsoil erosion under contemporary agriculture of about 1.5 millimeters a year. That's a fairly small number. Your fingernails grow faster than that, right? But to a geologist, it's actually screamingly fast, because it means that in just 20 years, you can erode through 1 inch of fertile topsoil. How fast does it take nature to make soil? Well, she makes it at a pace of about several % of 1 millimeter a year, meaning it takes centuries to up to 1,000 years to replace that inch of topsoil that can be eroded off a plowed field in just a couple decades. That is the long-term problem with soil loss that has plagued many societies around the world, and that I focused on in writing Dirt. Soil degradation, loss of organic matter, is another major problem that has much contemporary significance with the ideas of putting carbon back into the ground as a climate mitigation strategy. But the basic problem of soil loss is one that needs to be solved before you can essentially solve the problem of soil degradation. And so what I've given you so far is the data that it would take for you to calculate for yourself what the average longevity of an agricultural civilization would be. Because the net loss of about 1 millimeter a year implies that erosion of a typical 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick hill slope soil would only take about 500 to maybe 1,000 years. And that turns out to be approximately the lifespan of most major agricultural civilizations outside of major river floodplains. They are major exceptions. Things like the Nile River in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in the Middle East, the Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, or the rivers of lowland China, the big alluvial rivers. These are all places where farming has been practiced for millennia and sustained in those landscapes. And there's a geographic reason for that that's fairly simple and profound. Those are all major river floodplains. And what happens on a floodplain? Well, it floods, right? And what do the floodwaters bring? Well, they also bring silt, sand, and clay that can offset that millimeter a year erosion from tillage-based agriculture. How thick is a single grain of sand? Well, 1 to 2 millimeters. You could deposit, in other words, a single grain of sand in a flood every year and completely offset the erosive effects, the average global erosive effects of tillage-based agriculture. There's a geography to the nature of the problem. But in looking at the common history of many civilizations around the world, being a story of one of land degradation, I started to ask myself, is soil restoration possible? Could we reverse the historical pattern, or are we doomed to repeat the pattern that has plagued ancient civilizations, but this time on a global scale with no new place to go unless Elon Musk does figure out how to get us all to Mars? And I started learning the answer to this, that we can rebuild healthy, fertile soils remarkably fast in a place where you might not expect a geologist to do a lot of field work. And that is in my own backyard. Because when my wife and co-author in The Hidden Half of Nature, Ann Baclay, and I bought a house in North Seattle where we live, it came with a yard that had really dirt, not much in the way of soil. There was a lawn that was covering our side yard. When we stripped that lawn off to build the garden that Anne, the biologist, dreamed of having now that we had a home of our own, she was very disappointed to realize that we didn't have rich, fertile black earth. We had khaki dirt. There was not a single worm beneath that lawn. No soil life that we could see. It was essentially a biological desert. And being a biologist, she realized that we had the mineral part of healthy soil. What we didn't have was the biology. We didn't have organic matter. We didn't have living organisms in the soil. So she took it on herself to embark on what we describe in the book as her organic matter crusade, and compost and mulch and put wood chips down. And we started a worm bin to compost our food scraps. We'd rake up our neighbors' leaves and bring them back to our yard. They were happy to give us their leaves. We were like, you're just giving us fertilizer. This is great. And so through intensive composting and mulching, she was able to rebuild the health of the soil and the fertility of the land in a remarkable time. And I'll show you pictures of the soil we started with and the soil we have now in a moment. But what we started to realize is that despite all the labor that we were putting into the composting and mulching and bringing organic matter back to the yard, we were not the ones who were doing the real work of restoring fertility to the land. That was being done by the soil food web, by the organisms in the soil that were consuming all that compost, by the bacteria and fungi that were breaking those leaves and wood chips down, by the nematodes and protozoa that were eating the bacteria and the fungi, the microarthropods that were eating them all and excreting the bodies of those organisms out in their own waste. What we had was essentially a livestock, microbial livestock, that were manuring our soil from the inside out. And we started to see the idea of restoring fertility of our land as feeding the life in the soil so they could in turn help feed the plants that we were growing in the yard and bring our yard back to life. And as we started to look into what was behind this transition and what was actually controlling the restoration of fertility in our yard, we ran into papers that started talking about things known as exudates. Now, we all know that plants photosynthesize by combining carbon dioxide from the atmosphere with water that comes up from the roots to build their green bodies with photosynthate, with carbohydrates that they synthesize in photosynthesis. But what Ann and I were not taught about in graduate school was that roots are not just straws. We were trained to think of them as conduits that drew material up from the soil into plants, and they do that. It's a very important role for roots in nourishing plants. But the part that we didn't learn about until we were researching growing the hidden half of nature was that plants will push out through their roots what are known as exudates. Roots are two-way streets. There's stuff coming and there's stuff going. And those exudates, those things that they've made with their monopoly on photosynthesis, and they put those molecules together, they're pushing out through the roots things like carbohydrates, sugars, proteins, and lipids, fats. What does that sound like? Carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. That sounds a lot like food, doesn't it? Plants are pushing meals out of their roots into the soil to help feed the life in the soil. And they're doing that not just to be good neighbors, but they're doing that because the life in the soil does things in return for the plants. What does the soil food web provide for the plants? Well, it helps them acquire nutrients. Mycorrhizal fungi will send their hyphae out into the soil to grab things like phosphorus out of mineral particles in the soil and bring it back to the plant and trade it for those sugary exudates. Plants will, microbes in the soil will also manufacture compounds through their own metabolites that aid in plant defense and that boost the immune system of the plants. That can tee up their phytochemical production to help repel things like insect herbivores. In other words, there's this whole underground economy, this biological bazaar of trading going on, through which symbioses have developed between the microbes in the soil and the plants through their roots, symbioses that are every bit as complex and adaptive as those that we know between pollinators and flowers in the world of life above ground that we can see with our own senses. But these partnerships are happening below ground, and they're powerful partnerships. This shows you what happened to our soil after that sort of decade of composting and mulching. The khaki soil on the left is what we started with. It had about 1% organic matter. The soil on the right is has about 8% organic matter. In about 10 years, if you think, Anne was able to build about 6 inches of very rich, fertile topsoil over the course of a decade. If you think back to the numbers I shared with you earlier on how fast nature makes soil, it was clear that she was beating nature at her own game, building soil far faster than nature would have been expected to just restore things on her own. And this started planting the seeds of the idea that, wow, maybe we could actually restore fertility to the world's agricultural lands and do it at scale on real live operative farms. And that led me to take some time off from my job to travel around the world and visit farmers who were restoring fertility to their land. Those are the farmers whose stories I tell in Growing Revolution. And as I look at the potential for global soil restoration as a consequence of intensive farming. And what I found was that the farmers who were very successful at rebuilding the health and fertility of their land all practiced these common principles of conservation agriculture. They were involved in minimal or no disturbance of the ground, so they were no-till farmers or minimum or low-till. They were not disturbing the ground. They were planting permanent ground covers, so they always kept something, a living root in the plant to produce those exudates at all times to help feed soil life. So they would plant cover crops between their crops and sometimes even between the rows of crops as well as in a crop rotation. And they were adopting diverse crop rotations. They were not just growing 1 or 2 crops, they were growing a multitude of crops. Some of them would just grow a few cash crops and they would get their diversity in through their diversity of their cover crops. There's different ways to do it. But why would these principles work? All those little microbes on the screen up there are to basically illustrate that these 3 principles are essentially a recipe for cultivating and feeding the beneficial life in the soil. By not disturbing them, by feeding them, and giving them a diverse community to work with, it enables their ability to not only support the health of the crops, but also to rebuild soil organic matter and build soil fertility as a consequence of intensive farming. And that would be the real sea change, the real soil health revolution that I think we're on the cusp of being able to pursue as a global endeavor, because our agricultural enterprise, for the most part, for most of our agricultural history, in most places, with some key exceptions, has been a history of land degradation. If we can practice agriculture at a global scale following these principles of conservation agriculture, we could turn that around and agriculture could become essentially an engine or means for rebuilding soil fertility. These general principles that I just outlined translate to different settings around the world, but the specific practices involved in implementing them don't. Those would depend on the nature of the soil, the climate, the kind of crops one's growing, the technological level that farmers had access to, the economy that they were working within, the particular crops they wanted to grow, and so on and so on. But these general principles of soil building really seem to be universal and applied around the world. on various farms that I visited, from small-scale subsistence farms in Africa to very large-scale North American operations like the one that I'm showing you here now. So I want to introduce you to several of the farmers that I visited while researching and writing Growing a Revolution. The first being Dwayne Beck, who runs Dakota Lakes Research Farm in South Dakota. He adopted no-till practices decades ago, and then gradually introduced cover crops and complex rotations, eventually adopting these three principles of conservation agriculture. And what that allowed him to do is, compared to the traditional wheat fallow rotation that farmers in the region were using before they started down this road of experimentation, it allowed Dwayne to teach them how to reduce their inputs of diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide by more than half. And that resulted in immediate savings to farmers in the region. And because what are some of the big expenses on these farms? Well, diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide. So they're able to save money on their input expenses. We'll basically turn the light back on here with the miracle of automated lights. What happened to their crop yields? Well, their crop yields actually went up. Notice their soybean yields went from 63 bushels an acre to 79 when they went to the full conservation agriculture program. Their corn yields increased as well. So that's a recipe for more profitable farms. Spend less on inputs and harvest more that you can sell off the farm. When I asked Dwayne whether the practices that he used would actually work on small-scale subsistence farms in Africa, he basically teased me and said, well, why are you asking me? Why don't you go to Africa and ask a subsistence farmer there? And I thought that was a great idea. And so I went and visited. I could think of no greater person to visit than this gentleman here, Kofi Boa, who runs the No-Till Center near Kumasi, Ghana in equatorial West Africa. And notice his hat, got dirt, get soil. I knew when I got out of the truck to meet him that I would like the way that he thinks. What he's done is he's basically been teaching people in his corner of the world how to move from their traditional practices of slash and burn agriculture to a style of no-till farming with cover crops. And they get their diversity of their crops in not through cover crops, but by growing polycultures. Everything is an edible crop, and they're growing up to 6 or 8 different crops in the same field at the same time. So these are small-scale farms with operated through manual labor with very little capital. And there's a reason that these farmers were bypassed by the Green Revolution. They don't have access to the capital it takes to actually stock their farms with those technologies. What happened to their erosion rates when they adopted these principles of no-till cover crops and polycultures? Well, they basically shut erosion off. They cut it down by a factor of about 20. And what happened to their crop yields? Well, their corn yields tripled and their cowpea yields doubled. That's as good as the Green Revolution did, but this was without additional expenditures for fertilizer, without expenditures for other agrochemicals, pesticides, without any diesel. This was a different kind of agricultural revolution. It was a revolution in thought, in thinking about how they thought about the soil and how they treated their lands. And it was transformative to farming in the region around Kofi's village. The next farmer that I'd like to share my experience with you is David Brandt here. He runs Brandt Family Farm near Carroll, Ohio in the American heartland. And he grows wheat, corn, and soybeans for the North American commodity markets, but that's not all that he grows. He's standing there in that field modeling for you his tillage radishes in growing in a field of cover crops where there's 10 or 12 different crops actually in the field at the moment at that time. So he gets this diversity in between his cash crops. And notice the field in the background, those yellow soybeans back there. The green stuff in those fields are glyphosate-resistant mare's tail weeds. They've been sprayed 3 times the year I took the photograph. You can't kill them. That's become a big problem for his neighbors. David Brandt likes to joke that he doesn't have weeds. He plants them. He calls them cover crops, but he mows them over and kills them before they actually go to seed, and they help fertilize his land. And they've helped building his soil fertility back has helped him radically reduce his fertilizer and pesticide use to the point where he hardly uses any anymore. And I started teasing him that he was, probably could be called an organic-ish farmer, even though he's not an organic farmer. He shared with me sort of the stats from his neighbor's farm. They're sort of typical of the county average, where they were using full tillage, so they're burning a lot of diesel. They're using 200 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per acre a year, 2.5 quarts of Roundup, of glyphosate. Their total cost is on the order of $500 an acre, which at the yield of 100 bushels an acre the year I visited, means that at the $4 a bushel price they were losing $100 an acre. Something like 25%, a quarter of the farmers in Iowa were losing more than $100 an acre on their corn crops the year that I visited David Brandt. Well, how is Brandt doing? Well, Brandt's been doing no-till with cover crops for 44 years. He's been doing no-till for 44 years. He then integrated cover crops over the decades and has now gone more recently to diverse cover crops. But he doesn't till. He uses about 24 pounds of nitrogen an acre and about only a quart of Roundup. That costs him $320 an acre, which and he's harvesting much more than his neighbors. At that $4 bushel price, he was getting $400 an acre off his farm, whereas when his neighbors were losing $100 an acre. One of those is a good business model. The other obviously isn't. This is when I started turning into an optimist on the issue of global land degradation, when I started to realize that agricultural practices that rebuild the health and fertility of the land are getting to the point where they can be cost effective for farmers today. And if there's something that is fundamental to sustainable farming, is it has to be sustainable economically for the farmer to be sustainable, or it won't be sustained as a farm. What was David Brandt's secret? Well, he turned soil like this on the right that he had back in 1971, this khaki stuff that ought to look a lot like my yard was before my wife started restoring our soil. And what Brandt did is kind of the same thing to his farm that Ann did to our yard. Over the course of a couple decades, he turned that khaki stuff into this rich black earth that now has a carbon content that's comparable to or more than the native soil in the region. He basically restored fertility to his land, and he did it with a fully operational, commercially viable farm running the whole time. He turned agriculture into something, he made soil restoration a consequence of intensive agriculture. The last farmer that I'll share with you is Gabe Brown. He's a rancher and farmer in Bismarck, North Dakota, another part of the American heartland. And he's been bringing livestock back to in intensive rotational grazing to restore the native prairie on his farm. He's been very successful at that. But what I want to share with you is what he's done to his farmer's market plot, which over here on the right, it shows you his cows that he brings in to graze off the cover crops that he plants in the aftermath of his market garden vegetable crops. And he brings chickens in to eat the bugs that infest the cow patties that appear on the land when the cows graze off the cover crops. So what he's doing is he's using his cattle essentially as self-propelled methane digesters that are converting his cover crops into manure. He's accelerating the cycling of nutrients and helping to rebuild the fertility of his land. That allows him to spend less on fertilizer. He's not really, I think, using any fertilizer anymore on these plots. He's not using any pesticides. And he likes to say, instead of writing a check for fertilizer and pesticide, he's cashing a check for the beef and the eggs that are produced off the same plot. That's a better business model. How has it sort of worked for him? Well, he's turned his soil into this rich black earth. Again, it's comparable or more carbon rich than the native soil. The soil in his left hand here is the soil from his neighbor's organic farm. It's nowhere near as black, nowhere near as rich a soil. And what's the deal with the organic farm? They use tillage as their weed control practice, and that limits the ability to actually allow soil life to rebuild the soil organic matter, and it compromises it that way. So Gabe has exceeded them in terms of soil building. So where that really leaves us is these commonalities, these lessons from farms around the world boil down to the idea that the recipe for regenerative farming is ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. Go no-till, plant cover crops, and plant diverse rotations. Those principles of conservation agriculture. They seem to work in different settings around the world. You have to tailor them to that setting and to the kind of crops and the system that the farmers are working with. But as general guiding principles, they work. And you could add a fourth one to this if you want. And that would be to reintroduce livestock, animal husbandry, if they're grazed properly and used in ways that actually rebuild the health and fertility of the soil. They can be an accelerant for soil building. And that's a tool that I think is not as widely recognized and appreciated as it should be. So what are some of the benefits of rebuilding healthy, fertile soil? Well, it can result in higher farmer profits. That's legitimately what turned me into an optimist on this issue. It can produce comparable yields. It's not a choice between conventional agriculture and starving with going back to medieval farming practices. These farmers I visited were able to produce comparable yields with regenerative methods, but they used less fertilizer, less pesticide, and a lot less fossil fuel. And that increased the amount of soil carbon in their soil, the amount of soil organic matter, which led to greater water retention capabilities and to less off-site pollution. There's lots of benefits to be had from restoring healthy, fertile soil. And in case you're a little skeptical of the profitability angle, you don't have to just take my word for it. Claire Lacan and Jonathan Lundgren published a paper a couple years back where they examined the profitability of conventional and regenerative farms in the American Midwest. And the way you read this graph is that it's the total revenue is the height of these bars. So conventional farms on the left, regenerative farms on the right. I think it was about 20 farms of each. The height of the bar is the income per hectare. The colored stuff subtracts off the expenses for growing the crop. So the remaining white bar is the leftover profit. You'll notice the regenerative farms had a higher income, lower expenses. They were more profitable substantially, almost but not quite twice as profitable per hectare as the conventional farms. One of the things that surprised me though was Lundgren and Lacan also looked at the insect pest abundance on the cornfields that they were comparing here. And you'll notice that on the conventional cornfields, the ones that received pesticides, you had almost 10 times the corn pests. What was happening on the regenerative farms? Well, when you think about what happens when you use intensive pesticides, you not only kill the pests, but you also kill the predators, the insect predators of those pests. And when you think about which bounces back first, it's not the predators. The prey bounces back first. Every introductory ecology textbook will show you that, as does common sense. The prey comes back first, the predators come back later. So repeated pesticide use can actually lock you in a cycle of needing that pesticide use, whereas regeneratively farming and rebuilding insect allies that can control pests can greatly reduce the need for pesticides. So where we are today is I think we're poised on what I hope is the eve of a fifth agricultural revolution, what I like to call the soil health revolution. Because these principles of soil building and regenerating the soil fertility as a consequence of intensive farming is something that's starting to economically pan out for farmers, and it can produce lots of environmental co-benefits that are of interest to the community beyond the farming communities. So I think we're really at a pivotal point in human history where we may be able to turn our collective agricultural enterprise into a soil building enterprise rather than a soil degrading one, and thereby not have to repeat the lessons of history that I wrote about in the Dirt book. So I've gone from being a bit of a pessimist when I was writing Dirt and seeing how extensive the land degradation is around the world and how repeated the pattern of degradation in human civilizations has been. And I've come full circle to being an optimist based on interviewing farmers who have already turned the problem around on their farm. And by seeing their success, I know it can happen. I've seen it happen. I've seen farms where it has been done. And I think there's areas in South America where this has been done. South America is one of the leading areas in terms of no-till farming in the world and conservation agriculture. So I applaud all of you for your efforts to build soil health. And I appreciate the time that you've been listening to this talk. I obviously recommend the books for you for the history and background on looking at regenerative agriculture. It's one of the most important investments humanity can make in our collective future today is restoring the health and fertility of the world's topsoil. So I thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to at some point being able to visit with you.
Thank you very much, David, for your excellent presentation. We have received some questions. the times for soil loss, that periods of degradation of soil, are you talking about natural soil or agricultural soils? The time it takes to erode and degrade.
To erode, I basically looked at both the erosion rates under agricultural soils, but also the erosion rates for natural soils under native vegetation in parks and things like that. And the difference is what's really striking. The average rate of erosion off of plowed fields globally is about 1.5 millimeters a year, and it's a factor of 100 less than that under natural rates of natural vegetation. So it's the big difference with our agricultural soils has been that we've really accelerated the loss of soil, but it varies a lot. There's something like 7 or 8 orders of magnitude of variation between the lowest eroding soils and the most rapidly eroding soils. And there's a lot of variation between farms as well due to different kinds of farming practices. So soil erosion is highly variable, but if you average it over modern farms or even old farms in ancient civilizations, it's much faster than nature erodes soils. Under natural systems, soil building and soil erosion are roughly balanced. And I had a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the US in 1997 that quantifies that.
Thank you, David. Next question. When you talk about the recovery of soil in your garden, how can you extrapolate these concepts to large extensions? Any concept regarding extensive crops?
Exactly the question that I embarked on writing Growing a Revolution with, because when we restored the soil in our yard, we were using things like coffee grounds from a coffee shop. So it was, nitrogen that had started out in the tropics and made its way to Seattle through Starbucks or something, and then made its way to our garden. And we were using our neighbors' leaves, organic matter, wherever we could get it. So our yard is no model for agriculture, right? It's very, very different story. But the principles that were behind it in terms of minimal disturbance, adding organic matter, and a diversity of crops, those were the things that applied from farms large and small that I visited around the world in writing Growing a Revolution. So we used our garden as motivation to then go interview farmers who had already used principles like that to successfully restore their soil. The methods they used were completely different than the methods used in our yard. But what intrigued me so much was that the principles underlying it seemed to be in common, and that they worked both on small farms in Central America, some of the coffee regions I visited, and also small farms in equatorial Africa, like Kofi Boa's farm. But they also worked on large-scale mechanized farms in the Dakotas in the US, growing just a couple cash crops, but that integrated diversity through the diversity of cover crops. So the example of our yard was motivational more than exemplary.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, David. Next question. The possibility to generalize or to extend this practice, do you think that governments have to promote these practices, or this has to be only the initiative of individual farmers?
So far, what I've seen is that a lot of the excitement and initiative has been on behalf of individual farmers adopting these practices because they work. I would like to see more governmental support and encouragement for adopting conservation agricultural practices around the world. I think that there's a lot that could be done that could accelerate the adoption of these practices. And if I'm most familiar with agricultural policy in the United States, and here we subsidize the wrong practices. We actively support practices that degrade the land. And to me, that's bad social policy. It's bad agricultural policy. And frankly, it's bad health policy. I'm working on a new book that looks at the role of regenerative farming in the human food supply. So I would love to see more governmental support for adopting this style of more conservation agriculture oriented practices. And I'm optimistic that that could work because I've seen examples work from individual farmers. But I have to be honest that I've seen most of the enthusiasm so far in different parts of the world coming from the ground up, if you'll pardon the very bad pun. It's coming from, I see it, the enthusiasm coming from farmers who have adopted this and who are sharing their methods and their knowledge with their neighbors in ways that can help encourage wider adoption. But I would love to see much greater efforts on the behalf of agricultural policy to help farmers make the transition to this new style of thinking and this new style of farming, and also to do some of the research that will help to provide farmers in different regions with the knowledge and the techniques that apply for their crops in their port area of the world that would actually really work. There's need for all that.
Thank you very much, David. One more question. How do you imagine the reaction of agrochemical and fertilizer companies to when we propose this agriculture that would use less inputs?
I don't think they'll be very excited about it. I don't think that we can count on them to be very strong supporters of it. But that being said, there are new business opportunities in agriculture to help support farmers who adopt these kinds of methods. There's different kinds of equipment that can be used. So like John Deere, for example, in the US is happy to sell no-till planters. It's a good business model. There are other kinds of things in terms of microbial inoculants. There's other kinds of areas, in other words, that businesses that supply farmers could move into and encourage that would actually benefit from adopting these kinds of practices. But the areas that will not benefit are those that are selling conventional fertilizers and selling pesticides. If you can adopt methods that need less of their products, they won't be all that excited about telling people about those methods. But that said, there will still be a market for fertilizers and for pesticides, but at a lower level, I think. I don't think we'll ever get away completely from the idea of using any chemicals in agriculture at a global scale, although there are ways to make these kinds of principles and practices work in organic systems. You can walk away from the agrochemical model if one chooses. But I've interviewed a lot of farmers who are very reluctant to give up all the tools that they might use when they encounter problems on their farm. And I think the power of these new methods of regenerative agriculture is that it allows farmers to use far fewer inputs and save themselves money, but stay productive. So the short answer to your question is I don't expect to see a lot of enthusiasm among certain corners of the agricultural ecosphere, if you will, for adopting these practices. But I think they're essential for the health of agriculture over the long run, which will be good for everyone in agriculture, including those of us like myself who depend on it for our food.
Thank you very much, David. One more question. Why in United States no-till, why is not adopted massively not no-till in United States?
I'd like to know the answer to that myself. I think South America is probably the leading region of the world in the adoption of no-till. In the US, we have maybe 1/3 of our cropland is no-till at the moment. But if you just go back a few decades, it was hardly any that was in no-till. And if you project that trend out, hopefully by the middle part of this century, we will catch up with South America. I think that a big part of the reason there has not been greater adoption of these practices in North America is that we've been teaching people the opposite for 100 years in conventional agriculture, and it takes time to unlearn what you've been taught or to learn a new method of doing things. When I go around and I will lecture at agricultural universities in the United States and talk about what I've learned from interviewing farmers and writing these books, often it's the graduate students who are really interested in these methods and techniques. And some of the older faculty are thinking that we're sort of attacking what they've been teaching. And I'm actually just trying to convey the new science that supports these kinds of practices and the experiences that farmers who've adopted them have had. So I think we'll see much greater adoption in the United States in the coming years. Of course, a lot depends on our cycles of elections here and who's actually in office and promoting what. But there's a lot of people now in the political sphere in the United States who are at least aware of these ideas and are talking about new programs to actually help incentivize the wider adoption of conservation agriculture practices. So I choose to be an optimist and think that we'll see much more widespread adoption in the future. But frankly, it takes time for people to change their habits. We're all creatures of habits. It's difficult to make the choice to embark on a new system, particularly if you don't have experience in it and there are perceived risks in the transition. I would like to see much more public policy engaged in trying to help farmers minimize that risk and smooth the transition, as I was talking about earlier.
Gracias, David.
Thank you, David. Very good answer. One more question. Half of the food production is lost by pests and diseases, and in between the period between harvest and consumption. This is an important situation. What things can we do in order to reduce that loss of food?
That I was very impressed with in both researching in the academic literature about the role of things like disease suppressive soils is that one of the best recipes for healthy, fertile land, excuse me, we got the lights going on here. One of the best recipes for minimizing crop diseases is healthy, fertile soil. Life-filled soil creates resilience in the plants. There's a lot of material in that in the hidden half of nature that my wife Anna, my co-author and wife and I researched. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the style of regenerative agricultural practices can actually help on the front end of that loss. But there's also a lot that can be done on the storage end, on the shipping end, and particularly what happens in food waste in cities. Something like 1/3 of the food that makes it into cities is never eaten by a human being. And there's two ways that we can approach helping to reduce that food loss. One is trying to sort of make sure that we have systems in place so that it gets to people and it gets eaten. But what we could also do is be much better about recycling the organic matter that makes it into cities and is not eaten as food. Because there's a whole move for urban farming in terms of, which is most appropriate for vegetable production, in my view. But that could benefit from the repurposing of that urban organic matter, stuff that was grown in the countryside, brought to the cities, but never consumed by a person. That stuff through composting and mulching could be returned to urban farms and used. That's not as efficient as somebody eating the food in the first place, but at least it is minimizing the net waste from that. Whereas at present, it's just lost to the whole system. So there's a lot that can be done on that.
Bueno, fue la última pregunta. Muchísimas gracias, David, por tu conferencia. Ha sido muy, muy interesante. Y no sé si querés añadir algo más a tu presentación como despedida.
Again, I will ask the question again. Thank you very much. That was the last question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Is there anything else that you would like to add before closing?
No escuchó.
Can you hear David? Can you hear David? Again, now, okay. The question was, well, thank you. That was the last question. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Is there anything else you would like to add before leaving, before closing?
No. Muchas gracias. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to speak with you. Pleasure to present to you all, and I wish you all very well in your agricultural endeavors and efforts to improve soil in South America. And I look forward to being able to visit someday, and Martin, to speak in person. I would love doing that. So hopefully we'll see you all soon when we are free to travel around the world once again.